Welcome back to The Explainer. Some books just completely change the way you look at the world. Today, we're diving into one of those, Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad. We're going to break down the core ideas that got millions of people to rethink, well, pretty much everything they thought they knew about money.
All right, so here's what we've got on tap. We're going to look at these two dads in their two very different worlds. Then we'll get into their opposing views on money, that first crucial lesson about not working for it, what it really means to know your assets, and why, in the end, it's all about your mindset.
All right, let's get right into it. The whole story kicks off with this really simple but powerful idea. The author, as a kid, basically had two dads, and each one was pulling him in a totally different direction.
So on one side, you've got his actual father, who he calls Poor Dad. Now, this guy was super smart, right? Highly educated, had a PhD, but he was always struggling with money, even with a good paycheck. Then, you've got his best friend's dad, the rich dad. This guy never even finished the 8th grade, but he was an entrepreneur, and he ended up becoming one of the wealthiest men in Hawaii. It's this crazy contrast. One guy does everything right and struggles, while the other breaks the mold and becomes wealthy.
And as you can imagine, coming from such different places meant they had completely opposite ways of looking at the world, especially when it came to money. This clash in philosophy is really what the whole book is about.
I mean, just look at this. It really cuts to the core of their disagreement. Poor Dad would say, the love of money is the root of all evil. But Rich Dad flipped that completely on its head. He'd say, no, the lack of money is the root of all evil. So one guy sees money as this corrupting force, and the other sees the absence of it as the thing that causes all the trouble.
And you could see this difference in the way they talked every single day. Poor Dad's go-to phrase was, I can't afford it. Just a statement. End of story. Rich Dad saw that as just, well, mental laziness. He would say, don't say that. Ask a question instead. How can I afford it? See the difference? One just shuts your brain down while the other kicks it into gear to start solving the problem.
It was the same thing when they talked about careers. Poor Dad's advice was pretty standard, right? Study hard so you can find a good company to work for. But Rich Dad's advice? Study hard so you can buy a good company. It's all about becoming an employee versus becoming the employer.
And then there's risk. Poor Dad was all about playing it safe. Don't take any chances with your money. Rich Dad had a totally different take. For him, it wasn't about avoiding risk, it was about learning how to manage it. Okay, so this brings us to one of the most famous parts of the book, the author's very first and maybe most important lesson. And it didn't happen in a classroom. It started with a pretty weird job offer. So picture this. Kiyosaki is just 9 years old. He and his friend go up to Rich Dad and ask, hey, can you teach us how to be rich? Rich Dad's response is to offer them a job for 10 cents an hour, dusting canned goods in one of his stores. 10 cents.
So for 3 weeks, he's doing this boring, tedious work for basically nothing, and finally, he just snaps. He's had it. He storms up to Rich Dad, totally fed up, and says, you cheated me. You're just greedy, and you haven't taught me a single thing.
And this is the big reveal. Rich Dad just calmly explains that feeling, that frustration, that feeling of being trapped and wanting a bigger paycheck, that is exactly what life is like for most adults. And he gives it a name, the rat race. This endless cycle of get up, go to work, pay bills, repeat, all driven by two powerful emotions, fear and desire.
And just when you think the lesson is over, Rich Dad doubles down. He says, okay, new deal. You're going to keep working, but now I'm paying you nothing. Zero. The whole point was to get them to stop thinking like an employee who just wants a paycheck and start thinking like a business owner who sees opportunities everywhere. And you know what? It worked. It forced them to get creative. They noticed that the store was just tossing out old comic books. So, light bulb moment. They asked if they could have them, which they got for free. And what did they do? They started their very first business, a comic book library in a friend's basement. They charged other kids 10 cents to come in and read as many comics as they wanted. Suddenly, they were making money without even being there. That was it. That was the first taste of making money work for you.
So that little comic book library, that was their first real asset. And it's the perfect example of Rich Dad's #1 rule, the absolute foundation of everything he teaches. It all comes down to 2 simple words.
Okay, so an asset. Rich Dad's definition is super simple, no complicated financial jargon here. An asset is simply something that puts money in your pocket.
And a liability? You guessed it, it's the exact opposite. It's anything that takes money out of your pocket. That's it. It's all about which way the money is flowing.
And here's the really big idea. Rich Dad says the rich spend their time and money buying assets. Things like businesses, real estate that pays them rent, stocks, stuff that generates income. But the poor and the middle class, they often spend their money on liabilities that they think are assets. And the big one he always points to is your own house. You know, you've got a mortgage, taxes, maintenance. It's constantly taking money out of your pocket. Same thing with a car payment or credit card debt.
So when you boil it all down, the book's main argument is that the real difference between the rich and everyone else, it's not how big their paycheck is. It's all about their mindset and their level of financial education.
Rich Dad made this really powerful distinction. He'd say, there's a difference between being broke and being poor. Broke is temporary, but poor is eternal. Think about that. He himself went bankrupt at one point, but he never saw himself as poor. Why? Because being broke was just a situation, a temporary lack of cash. But being poor, that was a state of mind. His real wealth was what he knew, his financial intelligence, and nobody could ever take that away from him.
So let's wrap this all up. What are the big takeaways? First, your mind is your #1 asset, so you've got to invest in your financial education. Second, the whole goal is to learn how to make money work for you instead of spending your life working for it. To do that, you have to recognize the emotional traps, the fear and desire that keep you in that rat race. And finally, the game plan is simple. Spend your life building your asset column, not your liability column.
And that really leaves us with just one crucial question to ask ourselves. When you look at your own life, your own habits, are your thoughts and actions building genuine assets, or are they just building liabilities in disguise?